All right, so this lecture is on behavioral ecology, which is my second favorite topic. That's what I did my thesis on in college and my research on in college. I looked at mantis behavior and cricket behavior, but we looked at a whole bunch of other types of behaviors too in the studies that I've done. I just think it's so fascinating that something as complicated as behaviors can evolve. So what we're going to do throughout this discussion is we're going to talk about how we can go from these really simple behaviors logically to things that are super complex, and how there's usually genetic components to behaviors, and also that there are learned components or environmental factors that associate and help to develop behaviors. Okay, so first thing you have to know is, what is behavior? What's a good definition for it? And there's a really simple one. Behavior mainly consists of observable, muscle-powered movements. That's it. Now, those muscles could be smooth muscle, they could be cardiac muscle, they could even be glandular. Now, glandular isn't really muscle per se, but these are things that are stimulated by the nervous system and either cause movement or the release of something. That would be what I consider to be behavior. So, and a lot of people consider it to be behavior. So behaviors evolve, remember, because they give an organism some sort of selective advantage in the environment. Mating behaviors, foraging behaviors, defense behaviors. What's the term I'm looking for? Like carnivorous behaviors or attack behaviors, right? So there's so many different types of behaviors that exist. And we're going to talk about a bunch of them and like why they evolve and why it makes sense. So the AP exam does like to focus on evolution a lot, right? So we want to focus on how can behaviors evolve, what is their selective advantage of having that behavior in that particular environment, okay? Sometimes behaviors don't actually help an individual, but they help the species as a whole. That's called altruism, and we'll get to that at the end because I think that's one of the most interesting yet most complicated behaviors and why those types of things can evolve. Okay, so as I mentioned, behavior results from both genes and environmental factors. So it's not that simple that it's just genetic or it's just environmental, right? There's usually some combination of both, though there are some behaviors that we're finding are almost strictly genetic. Now, this can get into the nature-nurture debate, but remember, it's usually a mixture of the both. Certain traits are much more nature, they're much more genetic, much more innate, where other things are much more learned. They're based on your experiences, okay, right? And a lot of behaviors are polygenic. So like personality traits, right? It's not as simple as saying, oh, there's one gene that affects it. There's a lot of genes that come together that create the structure of your nervous system, which help to affect behaviors in certain ways. But one gene usually doesn't fully affect behaviors. We have noticed that some gene variants affect behavior a little bit, right? We can notice like, oh, people who have this certain gene, a specific genotype, have increased levels of narcissistic behavior or addictive behavior, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have it. So it's really a complicated thing that we try to tease out all of these different permutations from different genes and the environment, okay? So before we get into that, we have to get into a quick review and also some new information related to cell communication. Remember that stuff with ligands binding to receptors, blah, blah, blah. Well, there's this very specific thing that happens in our nervous system that I want to talk about called the action potential, and then talk about how does that that information get communicated from one nerve to another, okay? So because behaviors are controlled by the nervous system, we have to have a basic understanding of how it works, and this is a good opportunity to review things like active transport, ligand-gated ion channels, and also about how things get across the membrane, okay? So in general, nerves send these things, they're electrical signals. Now, how is it possible that we can generate electricity within our bodies? That's the first thing that we have to understand. So an action potential is the name for that signal that's sent. You can kind of see it in the upper right-hand corner here. And action potentials create or occur because there's this electrochemical gradient across the membrane of a neuron. So the neuron is a specialized cell that is usually super long. It doesn't have to be, but it could be up to like 3 feet long, one cell, that has this long projection called an axon, which acts like a wire where information goes down it. On the outside of the cell, there tends to be more of a positive charge, and on the inside, there tends to be more of a negative charge when it's at rest. And because of that, it creates what's called a membrane potential, a difference in charge across the membrane. The signal itself is a flipping of the charges. putting outside locally, just in a small area, locally flipping the charge so it's negative on the outside and positive on the inside. The signal itself deals with two main ions, sodium, which is on the outside, and potassium, which is on the inside. Now, both of those are positively charged ions, and we're going to talk about how that relates. It's just the inside's negative because there's more negative stuff in there. There's other negative things, okay? And there's also involved in this process is the sodium-potassium pump we talked about previously. The sodium-potassium pump uses active transport to pump sodium ions out and potassium ions in. So that gradient, as I mentioned, because the membrane's impermeable to ions on both sides, why is that? Well, it's because they're charged, right? Charged things cannot cross the membrane easily. There are, when you affect the membrane due to some stimulus, sometimes some of that sodium can leak across, and if there's enough of that happening, that can actually trigger this chain reaction of that electrical signal down the neuron, okay? So what it keeps and establishes the sodium on the outside and the potassium on the inside is that sodium-potassium pump we talked about, where it pumps 3 sodium ions out for every 2 in. Potassium ions in, excuse me. And because you're putting 3 positives out for every 2 in, that helps to create that unbalance in charge because there's more positives on the outside than there are on the inside, okay? This is showing you that sodium-potassium pump. Remember, it's active transport because it's pumping against the concentration gradient. It's going from low to high. Whenever you're going from low to high, that requires energy and a protein to help it do so. So the electrical signal itself is a flipping of those ions, right? Now there's ligand-gated ion channels, which we talked about, where a ligand has to bind to the channel, it opens up, and it's a facilitated diffusion protein that then allows ions to flow from a high concentration to a low concentration, okay? Ligand binds, causes a conformational change, causing it to open, ions flow through until something happens, the ligand gets destroyed or whatever, and it shuts itself, okay? There's also these things called voltage-gated ion channels, which we didn't talk about. Those respond to a change in voltage. So if the membrane changes a little bit, the polarization of the membrane changes a little bit, it triggers an opening of a channel, okay, which causes a rush of the ions in, which causes the adjacent ones to open, and the adjacent ones to open down the entire axon. And when that happens, you end up getting what's called an action potential, okay? This signal of the sodium leaking in, followed by this opening of these channels because of the voltage-gated action of them, causes a triggering chain reaction, and that is literally why you can think, why you can feel, why you can sense the environment and comprehend the universe. It's because of this process, okay? Super cool. Here's showing you a voltage-gated ion channel. You can see there that membrane depolarizing, if it's not showing it, is that like turning like of a white color. Okay, and you can see how it opens up the channel once that white color reaches it. And here's showing you that signal of the flipping of the charge and the opening of those voltage-gated channels down the entirety of the axon. This represents the cell membrane on either side of that thin axon, which acts as the wire, and the voltage is flipping due to those ions flipping, voltage flowing in. Eventually potassium flows out too, but you don't really have to know that. So once it reaches the end of a neuron, that electrical signal, it needs to bridge that gap. And that gap that it bridges is called a neurotransmitter, and we've discussed this before. Those are attached to ligand-gated ion channels, the neurotransmitter acting as the ligand, which triggers them to open another ion channel, and that ion channel causes sodium or some ion to flow in, which triggers an action potential down the next neuron. Or it causes a situation where, let's see, I'll show you here. This is what it looks like. You can zoom in. So once that action potential reaches the end here, it releases neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters bind to ligand-gated ion channels, and those ion channels will open up. It doesn't show it really in this animation. I'm going to show you another one in a second. Those ligand channels open up, ligand-gated ion channels open up, causing sodium to flow in or some other ion, which then depolarizes the membrane, creates another action potential on the adjacent one. If this was a muscle that was getting stimulated instead of a nerve, then it would just cause the muscle to contract through a series of complicated steps, okay? So, or causes a gland to release a hormone, for example. So here's showing you another one right here. Here's a little bit more, I guess, realistic looking one, though it's still entirely. But you can see the neurotransmitters being released. Okay, those are those little parts right here. Those little red ball-like structures are the neurotransmitters. It's hard to kind of see, but they're flowing, and you can see how when they bind, they open up the channel, and then the sodium ions flow in, generating another action potential down the next neuron, or as I said, contraction of a muscle. Okay, so that's your brief primer on the nervous system, just so that you understand it, and if they talk about it, you at least have a basic understanding of how it works. They shouldn't be asking you too complicated questions on it, but I still want to teach it briefly just so that you understand and review some of the topics we talked about previously. All right, so now we're getting into actual behaviors, right? Innate versus learned behaviors, that's where we're going to start. So an innate behavior is a behavior, as we mentioned before, one that is genetically predetermined. That means that every single individual within that population, within that species, does this behavior at birth, and they do not have to learn it from anybody. Okay, now it can be complicated or simple, right? But the key is that all individuals of the species do this behavior regardless of experience. One example is the sea turtles. When they're born, they know exactly when to go towards the water. They move that way, every single one of them. They haven't learned it. It's a genetically inborn trait. We are still trying to figure out, as scientists, how exactly it translates. We know it is because it's born in them. They haven't learned anything, right, to do this. And we can affect the behavior by manipulating their genes, but the exact mechanism, how all these things happen, is still kind of an area of study, okay? So let's talk about some innate behaviors. So first thing, a reflex versus an instinct. So a reflex is a rapid autonomic response, and it's usually very direct. So I'm going to show you a picture here. So here's a reflex. You can see here's a stimulus, which is something sharp, for example, or hot, or something flying at your eye or your face. You receive that information either at your eyes or you receive it as a sense of touch. And then there's a direct path. There's no thinking. It goes into your spinal cord or the base of your brain called your brainstem. And it doesn't go up into your brain. It's just a direct path from one neuron to the next, eventually causing a response. So you touch something hot, ouch. You pull your hand away instantly. You don't think about it. It just happens. That's a survival mechanism. These things are inborn. Every single one of us has it, and it's genetic. Okay, so there's an example of a behavior that is innate. It's a muscular-powered movement by the nervous system that affects what they're doing, which is behavior. Okay. Instincts, on the other hand, are a little bit more complicated. It's not as simple as you touch something and you move your arm, right? Or you step on something, you move your leg. Instinctual behavior are inborn things. We know because every individual in the species does it. And there's different examples of instinctual behavior. The first one we're going to talk about are called fixed action patterns. So these are really interesting. They're more complex, but once they're initiated by what's called a sign stimulus, a sign stimulus is something that is, it's what triggers the fixed action pattern. It has to go to completion. So the first one I'm going to talk about is egg rolling in the gray-lag geese. So what this does, if there's an egg that is no longer in the goose's nest, it'll go and retrieve it. And it goes and it grabs it with its bill and it pushes the egg back towards the nest. Now, this is an example of a fixed action pattern and it's innate because every single individual in the species can do it. But also, if you take something other than an egg, like a golf ball, and put it out there, it will attempt to bring it back to its nest. You could also put a volleyball out there. It still triggers the same response. They try to bring it back to their nest, and they have to go like this over and over and over again. And what's even more interesting than that, if you pull away the egg, once they start doing the behavior, they have to keep doing the behavior until they get back to the nest, regardless of if the egg's there or not. Okay, so that's an example of a fixed action pattern. It has to go to completion, which is them reaching their nest before they can snap out of it. Another example is the death roll in a hognose snake. So you can see here, when it feels attacked, it causes the hognose snake to do a death roll, and it basically flips over, opens its mouth, acts like it's dead. So if it's attacked by a predator, the predator thinks like, oh, it's not living or something's wrong with it, and hopefully leaves it alone, as opposed to eating it. Okay? And that would be the evolutionary advantage of having this behavior. The evolutionary advantage of the goose would be to be able to get its eggs back into the nest so that it can hatch properly. Another one is this is called the killdeer. There's also lots of plover species of bird do this behavior. It's called the broken wing display. Again, let's see. Now, when it feels threatened and it's near its nest, okay, it's not there, it's its baby, what it's going to do, it acts like it's wounded. And this is triggered and they cannot stop it, okay? It has to happen. So as soon as they feel danger is near, it causes a release of certain hormones, which causes this behavior where they literally act like their wings are broken. And once the predator gets close, they'll just fly away real quickly with the goal of getting that predator away from their nest to help their children survive. Okay? Again, an example of a fixed action pattern. All right? Okay. Whoop. Go past this. Another cool example of a fixed action pattern is aggressive behavior in a male stickleback fish. You can see here in the corner. This is the actual experiment. They have these different shaped things, these different shaped objects, and one actual shaped fish looks just like a stickleback, but its body is not painted red. Red is the sign stimulus in this case. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It's not going to attack anything unless it has red on it. So when it sees red, it gets angry and becomes aggressive, and it has to attack. And once it attacks, if the red stimulus is gone, we can stop that behavior. But as long as the red's present, it continues to be aggressive to chase other male sticklebacks away, because a true male stickleback has a red belly. You're going to see it in a second here. So now it just puts up something that looks nothing like the stickleback, but kind of does, right? Watch it attack it. It's the red. That's the important thing. That's the sign stimulus that triggers that aggressive behavior until that red disappears. And then it stops. See, even that thing, weird shape, it's going to trigger it. Be like it's going to attack it, despite the fact that it doesn't look like a stickleback. Okay, so that's a fixed action pattern. Other examples of innate movement are simple movements like taxis and kinesis. So a kinesis, excuse me, is a simple change in activity due to some sort of stimulus. You see this a lot in pill bugs. Sometimes we call these potato bugs here, but they're technically not. They're the little roly-poly things that roll up when you touch them. They're isopods. But what happens with them is when they are in a dry area, that stimulus triggers them to increase activity and move. Now, that's because they don't want to be in a dry area. They want to be in a cool, dark, damp area to help minimize drying out. So they'll keep moving faster and faster as they're in a dry area in random directions until all of a sudden they hit a moist area that's cool. And what happens? They then slow their activity down as soon as that happens. So the trigger for this behavior is simply, is it dry or is it moist? That helps them to survive. How? Because they don't want to dry out and they want to live in a protected dark area. That's what they do. They live under rocks and things, if you've ever seen these. But that's because this behavior that they tend to mostly be under rocks, because when they're not under a rock, they increase their activity until they get under a rock where it's moist and dark. Taxis is another simple behavior. The difference is the stimulus triggers a movement towards or away from that stimulus. So the stimulus of light causes flying insects to fly into a light bulb. You've seen this before, right? And the way you can remember this, this is specifically towards or away, not just changing activity, towards or away. Think about a taxi. A taxi is something that moves towards or away from something, just like taxis is moving towards or away from something. Now we get to more complicated behaviors, right? So remember, just because a behavior is learned doesn't mean there's not a genetic component to it. There probably is. But your experiences actually change this behavior in some way, okay? So learning is a modification of behavior resulting from experiences. As I said, just because it says not innate, the behavior itself is not innate. There are probably innate components to it, like the fact that you can process information in general is a genetically determined trait, and your nervous system being laid down is a genetically determined trait. So, now sometimes it seems like it's learning, but it's not. It's still innate. That is when, if you reach sexual maturity, certain behaviors that are innate only come out when you're developmentally ready to do so. It's still an innate behavior. Okay, so that's not learned, even though it seems like it is, because it happens later in life. Okay, so I just want to make a point that there's a difference there. Habituation is a simple kind of learning that is involving a loss of sensitivity to a stimulus that's unimportant. And everyone has experienced this, right? So you go into a room and you smell something, right? And you smell it initially, it's very strong, and then and you sit in the room for a while and you don't notice it anymore, right? Or a sound outside. You keep hearing a sound outside, eventually it goes away, or the humming of a fan. You don't pay any more attention to it. That's habituation, okay? Similar to how this guy is no longer listening to his wife for whatever reason, okay? So that's habituation. Imprinting is another type of learned behavior, and this is distinguished by a sensitive period. I think I mentioned this in class, but it's a sensitive period early on that an animal has to learn something, and if it doesn't learn it during that time, you're not going to be able to do it. Our language is an example of that. So if they've done studies with kids who have a long time ago who were actually left in the wild, and they were raised by wolves, and I'm not even joking, this is actually a real thing, they could not process proper human emotions to be consider them proper based on society. They could not develop language properly because they were past that sensitive period of doing so. Okay, so as I said, imprinting is generally irreversible. We can't change those behaviors. The classic example of this is with birds, and if the birds, when they hatch, you're the first thing that they see, they imprint on you. They think that you're their mother, and they will follow you around like they're your mother. So classic geese do this. They'll walk and follow their mother around. Ducks do this. If you imprint on a goose or a duck, and you're the first thing they see and not their mother, they're going to imprint on you, I should say, and follow you around thinking you to be their mother, because normally that's the first thing that they should be seeing. Bird song is an example of this too, right? And I think I mentioned this, that like in sparrows, I think I said it was canaries, I flipped it when I talked about it in class, but in sparrows, you have to learn that specific song during a sensitive period, right? If they didn't do this learning during the sensitive period, they don't have a template in which to develop their final song, which is used for mating and identifying members of the same species. Whereas a canary, their whole entire life, they're basically learning. Now, they may have a little bit of a sensitive period here, but basically the song is constantly changed and shifted throughout the course of throughout different years. So they change their song. It's a little more complicated of a behavior, and that's more of an open-ended learning type of situation. The next type of learning is associative learning. And associative learning is when you associate a stimulus by responding with a behavior. So you're given a reward for doing something, so you keep doing it, right? That makes sense. There's two different types of associative behavior. There's classical conditioning, or a conditioned reflex, where you associate something new with obtaining a resource, and you do a reflex behavior. So like if all of a sudden every time you hear a little bell, and this is what happened with Pavlov's dog, we ring a bell and we give the dog food. We ring the bell and we give the dog food. And when the dog is ready to eat, it salivates, okay? Which makes sense, so do we. Eventually, just ringing the bell and not presenting the food triggers salivation, and I can't stop it, right? Until you, over the time, it would learn that it doesn't get food anymore, eventually that would go away. So the actual, a different sound, right, a bell, triggers a reflex. In this case, that's classical conditioning. That's a learned behavior. And we can do this kind of stuff. We do it like with cats, like with can openers and like electric can openers. They'll hear that, or they'll hear like the shaking of a treat bag. That is an example of classical conditioning. They come running and they probably salivate. Whereas operant conditioning is a little bit more complicated. That's trial and error learning. An animal learns to associate one of its behaviors with a reward. And kind of the treat idea is a mixture of both, because they will salivate, but also they're going to run to you when they hear that sound. That running is more of a operant conditioning behavior, coming over there. It's going to modify its behavior to get a reward or to avoid a punishment. So the classic example is animals learning to not mess with, like porcupines. Like it messes with it once, it gets a full face of quills. It's never going to mess with that again because of how painful it was. Got a punishment in this case. The same thing with this mouse, which is horrible. This is a horrible experiment, but we learned about how this works. The mouse actually learns to only it'll get food when certain lights are on. When the green light's on, it presses the button, it gets food. When the red light's on, if it presses the button, it gets shocked. So it learns to no longer press the button when it's red and only press it when it's green. Okay, so this is an example of operant conditioning, a little bit more complicated. Other cool, interesting behaviors, like, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, like when you were a kid, you played house, or you played doctor, or you played teacher, or whatever that is. Play is the purpose of it, evolutionarily, is to practice. You think of like when you see two lion cubs like play fighting each other. Why are they doing that? They're learning in a very non-threatening way how to develop the skills necessary to be an adult. The same thing is what happens in children. That's what play is. In a very non-threatening way, they are playing things like teacher. They're learning what their roles can be in society. They're practicing skills. And that's what play is. And that's the evolutionary benefit of it. Okay, cognition is a little bit more complicated. Okay, so cognitions are the higher order behaviors. This is the ability to process and store new information and then use that information to respond somehow. Okay, so perceiving, you judge, reason, learning, evaluating, remembering. That's all cognition. These are higher order behaviors. Not all organisms exhibit a cognition, but it doesn't have to even be a complicated organism to necessarily exhibit cognition. Okay, so many animals find their way around space using landmarks. We do this. We have a visualized map of our world. We remember it, and we can kind of know where we're going within it, right? But other organisms do that as well. So like a digger wasp, if we do this is a classic experiment. We put around the digger wasp's nest, we put a bunch of pine cones. So it learns to associate the circular shape of the pine cones with its nest. If we move the circular shape of pine cones just next to it, like a foot away, it can no longer find its nest. Even though the nest is a foot away, it's going to just sit in the middle of the pine cones and be like, hey, where's my nest? Okay? And what's really interesting, it's not the pine cone itself for them that's the landmark. It's the shape, the circular shape. Because what it'll do is we keep the pine cones around the nest, change the shape to a triangle, but we put a circular shape of rocks in the place that we had previously put the pine cones in a circular shape where the nest was not. They still go to where the circular shape is. So fascinating how different organisms and different animals process information and how that manifests itself as behavior. Okay, so landmarks are the names of things that they use to associate with different places. Another interesting behavior is optimal foraging. Well, it's not a behavior, but foraging behaviors in general. There's this thing called optimal foraging theory, which deals with the trade-offs between food obtaining behaviors, right? Cost versus reward, right? Risk versus reward for foraging strategies. And animals, what they take into account, and they're not doing this consciously, it just happens. Evolution prunes this over the course of time, that they're going to weigh the amount of energy obtained going to get something, the energy it costs to go get it. Because if you're using more energy to get something than it is to get it, right, than to eat the food, then there's no point in doing it. And also the risk of dying by going to get it. There's a risk inherently going to get food. You're no longer in your home, you're not protected, okay? So all of these different things weigh out for an organism to come up with this optimal foraging theory for that specific species within the niche that it exists in. Okay, so natural selection should maximize benefit in this case. So this is showing you kind of a graph that looks at optimal foraging theory, and when you look, so here's the travel time it takes to get it. This is the time in the patch of food that it's eating and obtaining energy, right? And at some point, there's an optimal rate in which the amount of food it's getting is outweighed by the risk and the amount of time that's kind of wasted in that spot. So it'll probably move to another patch to get more food. A classic example of how you think about this, I think about this when I rake leaves or when I'm picking up like laundry off the ground. The first patch of laundry you get tons of laundry. But then by the end of it, you're like picking up random individual socks. That first thing, you get tons of energy from it. You're not maximizing the energy obtained or the amount of laundry you're getting as time goes on. At some point, you should probably, if we're trying to get the most amount of laundry possible, you want to move on to another pile of laundry. It'll be quicker to get the most in that given amount of time. Now, obviously, you need to clean all your laundry, so it's a little bit different situation. But that is the idea behind optimal foraging theory, that they're going to kind of move on, and they have to take these different risk-reward they have to think about risk and reward when they're doing different behaviors. Even though they're not technically thinking about it, the behavior just gets pruned through natural selection. At least most animals don't think about it. Okay, social behavior. Social behavior is, I love social behavior. It's super interesting. This is usually interactions between two or more animals of the same species. Usually that's what we're talking about when we talk about social behavior, because most species don't interact outside of competing with each other or whatever, and that's not true collectively. We'll talk about when we get into ecology a little bit more. We'll talk about some of those behaviors where two different species interact with each other in positive ways or negative ways, but right now we're going to focus on two individuals of the same species. So the first thing you want to understand is social behavior involves communicating. And what is communication? So this is a big part of what my thesis focused on in college. A signal is a behavior that causes a change in the behavior of another animal. So when I say sun, because you had consistency with that same word, sun, you know in the English language that sun refers to, that giant ball of helium and hydrogen that's fusing those two things together to create energy out in space. Or I could be referring to like my sun, right? But we know that that has some content, has some meaning, and that's because of consistency, right? So signals have some information content. It doesn't have to be auditory. It could be visual. We pick up visual cues all the time. It could be auditory. We hear things. That means things to us. There's tactile signals, electrical signals even. Sometimes there's olfactory signals that are released. Like we don't really, like if someone smells, they haven't showered in a while, you'd be like, well, I don't want to really be around that person maybe, because they're not showering. But there's other types of sense too that actually cause physical behavioral changes within you, not just like, oh, that doesn't smell good. It actually causes a physical change within your body and you don't even notice the scent of it. We'll talk about those in a second. So communication systems evolve due to honesty. Honesty is necessary. Consistency and honesty within the signal is important. If you have too much dishonesty, that will actually lead to collapse of the communication system. Because if I'm pointing to a picture of the sun and I'm saying sun, moon, orange, Dave, what's another word? Heart, intelligent. You're gonna be like, what does that mean? If you don't have any context, you have no idea what that means. But if I keep consistently saying sun, 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 and then I point to other things that look like the sun, you can start to create a mental map of what the word sun means and what information content is in that signal. So, if you're being dishonest, the whole communication system will collapse. And that's why it's very rare to see deceptive behavior in interspecific interactions. It can happen in lower organisms, and when I say lower, I don't mean like in organisms that don't have really complicated immune or nervous systems, but it does happen sometimes. Okay, and that's what I studied in crickets. I want to determine, are they lying to each other through the chirping that they make, and I'll get into that when I get into agonistic behavior in a second. Oh, there it is. So agonistic behavior is usually a contest in which one competitor gains an advantage, such as mates or resources or land or something like that. It's usually to a limited resource. And the purpose of it is to kind of, sometimes agonistic behavior involves just communicating, like when crickets chirp against each other and they scream at each other and basically they try to avoid a physical altercation. Because the one that's stronger is going to produce a stronger chirp. What I was trying to see is if they perceive their if they're at similar size and they perceive their competitor as being weak due to an artificial song I was putting in, would they change their call structure just so they can avoid an altercation? So I was seeing if they were technically lying to each other. I didn't find that was the case. But yeah, so agonistic behavior is just a contest where you're fighting over resources. And you guys saw, obviously, the giraffes fighting, talked about that several times as an example of agonistic behavior. We see it all over the place. There's dominance hierarchies, right? Where a high-ranking individual will gain access to resources. So there's usually like an alpha individual in that society. So like a lot of mammals, you'll have an alpha male. Like in the case of gorillas, you have the silverback gorilla. He's the dominant gorilla until he gets too old, and he's eventually fought off by a younger, stronger male that then takes over his place as the alpha male. And that alpha male is going to have more mating opportunities than the rest of the male gorillas. Okay, territoriality, kind of related to that too, but not exactly the same thing. Where animals defend a specific home range. So ring-tailed lemurs do things like that. Oops. And I have some videos on your notes if you want to check those out of these two behaviors. I just didn't want to waste your time. If you're interested, click on the QR code on there to watch videos about dominance hierarchies in gorillas and also territoriality in ring-tailed lemurs. So again, natural selection is going to favor mating behavior that allows for a female or a male to assess the quality of the mating partner because they want to pick the partner that has the best traits to pass their genes on with. So courtship is a behavior pattern that leads up to copulation or gamete release in a species with external fertilization, and there's internal fertilization where you actually have two people mate physically, where the sperm fertilized within the organism, and external fertilization where a female lays her eggs and then allows the male to fertilize externally. Usually it's a series of displays and movements or sounds that are made by the male, female, or both. So one example, again, we'll bring the stickleback up again because they love talking about it on the AP exam. The male kind of does a little dance when he sees a female with a swollen belly, meaning she's filled with eggs. He'll zigzag, and if the female's impressed, she'll go into a little nest that was created by the male. The male creates this nest. The female will then lay her eggs in the nest. She'll leave, and the male will follow behind her, fertilize the eggs, and boom. If she's not impressed, she'll just swim away. Okay, so that's an example of courtship behavior. There's also some other fascinating ones. Let's look at male frigate birds. Fast forward a little bit here so you can see them.
Build a nest, and when the nest is ready, they will sit on the nest, open the wings.
They'll open their wings and blow up this huge pouch on their neck. The males with the most beautiful, big, swollen pouches are the ones that are going to attract more females. And they do that. They just shake their wings. Like, look at me, how impressive I am. And the females will pick which males they want to mate with. Best singer, have the best giant air pouch, and that's how they mate. It's fascinating. Another example is the peacock classic example here. So male peacocks have these insane, kind of like, it's not a headdress, but like these beautiful feather patterns on them. And you'll see how the male, this is his mating ritual, he sees a female, he opens up his feathers to show these beautiful feathers and tries to impress a female. He starts chirping, there's the female peacock, or the female peafowl in the back there. See how he's kind of aggressive, he's running at her, so be like, look how impressive my headdress is. And if she is impressed, she will allow him to mate with her. Okay. Another interesting point to bring up, though, about that specifically. Oops. Let me try to make this full screen again. It won't let me for some reason. Enter full screen. There we go. With peacocks is this idea, it's called the handicap principle. I talked about it in one of my classes already, but it's this idea, well, why would males evolve these giant, super cumbersome, beautiful headdresses? Like, that makes them so easy to be seen and eaten by predators. Like, why would that evolve? So the answer to that is called the handicap principle, which is this idea that if a male can survive to adulthood and reproductive age, despite this crazy handicap it has, its other genes must be insane. They must be so superior otherwise if they can survive to that point because of this handicap that they have. And that's how they think that this behavior and these courtship rituals and that huge display evolved in males. So mating relationships between males and females varies a great deal too from species to species depending on their life history strategies. So like there's promiscuous relationships where there's no strong pair bonds or lasting relationships. Usually that also corresponds with producing lots of children, hoping that only a few make it because you don't really care about taking care of those children. Then there's monogamy, which is synonymous with parental care, right, where one male mates with one female for life. And then there's polygamy, which is one individual of one sex mates with several of the other, a lot of times that happens in dominance hierarchy situations, where you have like one dominant walrus mates with almost all the females, and the other males don't get many mating opportunities at all until they take out the dominant male and they become the dominant one. So pheromones, I alluded to this earlier, pheromones are chemicals that are produced that actually elicit responses. So whenever you watch ants follow in a line, how do they know to follow in the exact line behind the other one? They don't use visual cues. They use a scent cue. So they're just following a pheromone trail with the ants. And in fact, ink, if you use like pen ink, normal pen ink, and you draw it on a paper, termites will follow it because that chemical and the scent that it gives off mimics that of their pheromones, and they'll just follow it around. So you can draw a line and you can make them kind of like go in a circle following that pen ink smell. That's the same way that beetles will aggregate on a food source that way, and for mating they'll aggregate using pheromones. When they're ready to mate, they produce a chemical that causes the beetles to all aggregate. Okay, and it's quite like, do humans have pheromones? It's kind of debated. They're not sure, but we do have scents that cause change. We actually physically smell it cause physiological changes. We're not sure if we have something that we don't smell at all that causes a physiological change within us. Okay, so they do like to talk about the waggle dance in bees. So the bees, the way they communicate, bees are amazing, first off, but successful foragers, let's say they find a patch of awesome flowers with lots of pollen. They can share that information with the hive, and we actually know exactly what they're saying because we can look at their behavior and it tells us information. Okay, so like for example, what the bee does is I'm going to show you a video of this. It's going to do this kind of round pattern, and then it gets to the end and it's going to waggle in the direction of the flower, and how often it waggles will tell it, or how long it waggles for tells you how far away that pollen source or that water source or that new housing place is away. And we can actually tell because we follow them afterwards and we use the information content to figure out exactly where they're going to go. Here's showing you a video of that. Here's the waggle dance. So the male goes around. You can see that male in the center there. And all the other ones are watching and paying attention. So they're actually going to follow that male. So it's slightly less than a second. So it's probably about 0.75 kilometers to a half a kilometer away in that direction based on the flow, or flow, I just said that, based on the direction from the angle from the sun that they're doing it and how long they do it. It's called the waggle dance. All right, last thing we want to focus on is these big questions about morality, about altruism. How can morality evolve? People argue like morality can't evolve. That doesn't make sense. Selfishness is what evolution is all about, right? Survival of the fittest, right? Why am I nice to my neighbor if she is a competitor of mine? How does altruism, which is another term for morality, how does altruism evolve? That's the term we use in behavior for morality, essentially. What is morality? Are people really selfless? Okay. So the first thing is reciprocal altruism. It's this idea that you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? So you decrease your fitness now so that hopefully the other person within the group will do the same for you later, increasing the fitness of everybody within the group overall. Warning calls are a great example of this. This is the howler monkey. Now look, I'm going to say this right now when you watch this video. Ask me in class to do a howler monkey impression for you. I will do it, but only if you ask me. So you have to remember to ask me to do the howler monkey impression in class. Okay? So, one male will go up and risk his life, essentially, to look out for intruders or predators. And if it hears it, it will scream, this super loud, low-pitched scream that it does. And it puts itself in danger so everyone else can escape. But everyone takes a turn doing it, and that increases the overall fitness of everybody. Everyone survives more often because everyone does that behavior, increasing their fitness. Grooming behavior is an example of this, right? Why would I spend time picking things off now? There's a little bit, I can get some food from it, but it's also a social reciprocal altruism. You pick my parasites off, I'll pick your parasites off. Okay. Another interesting idea is this idea of kin selection, and we're more likely to be altruistic to blood relatives because we share genes with them, right? So if you help the survivability of your brothers or sisters' children, because they share approximately your brother and sister share half your genes, and their kids share a quarter of your genes, you are increasing your fitness because you're helping them to survive. You are still passing some of your genes on to the next generation, even if you never have kids. So it's possible to have fitness in these social groups, despite the fact that you are not actually passing your physical genes on to the next generation. So here's showing you a bunch of those relationships, right, between brothers and sisters, and parents are half. You share about point to quarter with a grandparent, right? Grandchildren then share 0.25 with each other. So like cousins would share 0.125, excuse me. Just an interesting way to think about how these behaviors can evolve within social groups, especially in human beings, right? Because original hunter-gatherer societies, your social group was your family, and that's what you hunted and gathered with, until you moved on and you made it with someone else in another social group to increase genetic variation. So here's the question, is it more beneficial to have 2 kids? Each of your children gets half your genes, or is it more helpful to help your brother or sister take care of 4? In that case, the benefit is pretty much the same, which is really interesting to think about. The last couple of behaviors, we're going to talk about circadian rhythms and circannular rhythms. And a circadian rhythm, that occurs on a daily cycle. That's your biological clock. Sleeping and waking is an example, and that's usually synchronized with dark and light throughout the day. Whereas a circannular rhythm is influenced by dark and light, but on a yearly cycle. So the actual angle of the sun in the sky at noon can affect that. So migratory and some reproductive behaviors are affected by circannular rhythms. Here's showing you the release of certain hormones such as melatonin and how your nervous system controls this process. I'm not going to get into it. You can pause it and look at this because it's really interesting. But at night, melatonin secretion starts, which causes you to feel sleepy. You fall asleep. Okay, and then these are examples of some circannular things like molting, breeding, migrations, wintering, that kind of thing. Okay. Last type of behavior, plant behavior. And I'm just going to talk about one which is really cool. It's called phototrophism. And plants that grow towards or away from the sunlight, the way it works is very simple. Why would you grow? What's the benefit of doing so? To get more sunlight, to do more photosynthesis. But the way it works is a hormone called auxin actually stimulates the back the cells away from the light to induce elongation. It's like a growth factor almost, or like a type of growth hormone. And auxin binds to the receptor. It causes a signal transduction pathway, which stimulates the production of genes, turning transcription factors on, stimulating the production of genes to produce growth proteins, which causes elongation in those individual cells. Those cells on the back end elongate, the ones on the short end do not. That causes the whole plant to tip, causing that behavioral change within a plant. I thought that was super interesting. All right, that is behavior. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, because I love this stuff. It's my favorite.